Where Do They All Belong? A short story for Halloween by John Spacey. She stood an arm's length behind and watched the young man wee against the tree. Reaching out with her long, slender finger, she used the tip of a broken nail to trace an imaginary line in the air, a hair's breadth from the skin on the back of the young man's neck. He shivered. "For God's sake," he exclaimed, slurring his S's as he splashed his shoes. The young man turned and stumbled back the way he had come, ducking and squeezing through the hole in the fence through which he previously popped to find a place to pee on his zigzagging travels from pub to home. He'd known he should use the loo in the club before venturing out into the cool night air, but he'd wanted to get to the front of the queue at the kebab shop, and so he'd taken a chance. His improvised toilet had been the trunk of an old tree on a little strip of land hidden from view behind a fence he'd walked past 1,000 times without ever stopping to wonder what may be enclosed, held from view by an inch or two of timber. He, like everyone, simply ignored it, navigated around it, never asked why. The young man had had to pull a bit of rotten timber from the fence to gain entry, his desperation having forced his vandalism. Still zipping up his flies, the young man continued upon his way, his weaving wander watched by the eyes in the dark. Eyes that should have remained in the dark, but that now saw salvation. The woman with the broken nails popped her head through the newly created hole in the fence and screamed a silent scream into the night. Once, it had been used by supporters of the king to escape from Cromwell's men, a tunnel, one of three, that began in the cellar of the village tavern, their entrances hidden from view. The other two tunnels led to dead ends. They curved left and right in a haphazard fashion before nothing. Red herrings. Pursuers would be twice as likely to make the wrong choice as the right one, that being the one that led to sanctuary, actual, proper sanctuary. It exited into the church, the one place safe from Cromwell's supporters. All were safe in the house of God, and usually for only a very small fee. Later it had become a local tradition that the tunnel had been used by brides to make their way to the church on the big day, but farther back than anyone can now remember, it was deemed no longer safe to do so. Portions of the roof of the tunnels had begun to collapse. The tunnels had been sealed at both ends, their once secret existence a secret once more. The church continued to serve the community for many years more, as did the tavern. The church, with its relatively deep pockets, remained as pretty as ever while the tavern fell into disrepair. Eventually, having been a family business since time immemorial, the costs of keeping such a building required the assistance of a brewery. In the late 1960s, this newly acquired partner, having become aware of the existence of the legendary tunnels during renovations of the cellars, jumped upon the revelation and used it to promote the hostelry, managing to get the local television news to do a piece on the pub. The landlord's daughter was engaged at the time, and a smiling reporter with a smoking pipe clamped between his teeth had asked if she was tempted to take the tunnel to the church on her special day. "Not on your Nelly," she'd laughed. She stood in the darkness, 7 steps from the back door, just like the government said she should, and drew deeply on the cigarette. She folded her arms across her chest and gazed up at the stars as she exhaled. She shivered. She took a couple more puffs before stubbing the cigarette out in the flower pot she kept by the shed. It was overflowing. She'd smoked a lot since he'd gone. She'd need a bigger pot. The soft white curtains billowed out across the tiny, half-finished patio through the open doors. She held them back as she slid the glass door closed behind her, then drew them together, along with a heavier pair of curtains that ran roomside. Hiding the velvety darkness of the garden from within, she turned down the thermostat on the wall and went to brush her teeth. "No chance, I daren't ruin these." She held aloft her left hand, displaying her perfectly manicured talons. Her companion tutted and lifted the crate of milk stout to her chest. "I'll just come back for that one then, shall I?" "Yes, please," she called after her chief bridesmaid, who continued replenishing the stock in the bar for the private party tonight. The landlord had never before closed his doors to paying customers, but he'd also never before experienced the night before his only daughter's wedding. A man-free zone, just half a dozen of her best friends and the keys to the jukebox. It was set to be a hen night to remember. The local menfolk had complained that it was unfair that they'd be asked to frequent another establishment for a whole evening, but the landlord wouldn't be swayed. Begrudgingly, they'd had to drink that night in the local club, the Working Men's Club, where women weren't allowed. Any night. Several milk stouts and a couple of baby shams into the evening, talk had turned to the landlord's daughter's recent television debut. As a result of her performance, her friends had given her the nickname Nellie. She quite liked it. "You'd not catch me down there with the spiders and the wood lice," Nellie shivered. "Not for all the tea in China," the chief bridesmaid assured those gathered. "Well, I think I'd have to. Not all the way in, but I don't think I could resist taking a little peep." The groom's sister had broken off from putting rollers in the bride's hair to offer her opinion, muttered through a mouthful of hair grips. "I bet it's dead spooky." "I'm sure it is. That's another good reason to not go." "Oh, go on, let's have a quick shufty." "Not on your—" She paused, grinning. "Nellie!" her friends chorused. Nellie turned and added a brandy from the optics behind the bar to her half-finished glass of baby sham, then opened another baby sham. It was no good. Sleep wasn't anywhere close by. She tried, but it just wouldn't come. Her daughter's first night away with her father. How she'd longed for the occasional Saturday night off from being mother recently, but now, with her daughter out of her protection, she wasn't able to switch off. Finally, when she realised she was drumming her fingertips on the duvet in the darkness, she gave in to insomnia and sprang out of bed. The light from the hallway spilled across the kitchen floor as she made her way to the fridge and collected a bottle. She grabbed a large wine glass from the draining board and pulled a stool from under the counter. Pink wine. He'd hated that, the prick. She grimaced as she glugged a mouthful back, stood and retrieved the cigarettes and lighter from their hiding place above the plates cupboard. She spotted her phone on the dining table as she made her way to the patio doors. A green flashing light indicated a message. Shit! She slipped the cigarettes into the pocket of her gown and retrieved the phone, reading the message as she turned to the curtains and began to open them. A photo of her little angel, Angela, tucked up, asleep, safe and sound at Daddy's house with Daddy. She smiled, sniffed and swapped phone for cigarettes. Her hand on the handle, she gazed out into the gloom of the garden, peering past her own reflection behind the glass. Very little to see, a small patch of patio illuminated by the light from behind her, and another midway up the garden, this one courtesy of the bedroom light she'd neglected to turn off. He hated when she left the lights on, the prick. She thought she saw something, maybe a hedgehog, over by the sundial. She tilted her head to look past her reflection. It was a hedgehog. How lovely. She snatched at the handle and slid back the door. Again, she tilted her head to see past her reflection, but the door was open. The vague figure stood before her. It had been there all along, peering in as she'd peered out, its nose inches from her own. She opened her mouth to scream as the figure did likewise. She screamed hard and loud, rooted to the spot as the apparition screamed a scream back at her. A silent scream, the silence of which drowned out the sound of the lady in the dressing gown's terror. The wispy apparition's deep dark eyes seemed to search those of the lady in the gown. Seeming to beg and to plead, the silent screams continued until the figure raised a hand, placing a finger that seemed to be made of smoke and dust on the mother's lips, and they shivered. "What in God's name possessed you to let her?" The bridesmaid stared at her own feet. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rigby, I couldn't stop her." "Look," interrupted the police officer, "we've been all the way to the end of both tunnels. Neither leads anywhere. There's nowhere to hide. She isn't down there. She's obviously playing some kind of prank on you all." "Yes, thank you, officer. You're right. I'll wring her bloody neck when I get my hands on her. I'm sorry you had to come out." Not at all, not at all. Happy to help. Happy to serve." The constable winked. "Of course, officer. Help yourself. And you, Eleanor," he shouted through the little door to the old tunnels. "Your mother's beside herself. Stop pissing about and go easy on those bloody baby shams." She'd sob if she could. She was struggling to breathe. Dust as thick as soil filled the air around her, and she tried to thrash but couldn't. She tried to cough. She couldn't. She tried to breathe. She couldn't. She tried to sit up. Her fingers could move, and they did. Frantically in the air, the only part of her that was visible, or would be visible, if there were any light now that the powerful torch she brought with her was buried beneath a few feet of soil. The soil that collapsed from the roof of the third tunnel. The soil that now pressed against her face, suffocating her slowly as more joined it from above. She clawed desperately at the earth, snapping her beautiful nails and drawing blood from her fingertips. She managed to open her mouth, but soil rushed to fill this new void created and stole the scream she tried to scream. But still she didn't die. Her life prevailed by some fluke of nature, not forever, but for an hour. An hour imprisoned within the very bowels of the earth, unable to move an inch, whilst at the same time suffering the extended agony of suffocation. Her mind raced, her chest burned. She soon accepted it was hopeless and silently pled with every deity to end her damnation. Maybe one listened and eventually took pity, but he let her suffer first. Similar soil to that which beneath she had perished had been responsible for sealing up the mouth to the third tunnel during the same collapse. The earth that fell was moist. It cast little dust, and when the police officers and volunteers had finished their searches, they mistakenly believed they'd searched every inch. The following day, long after she had suffered her own personal eternity of hell before finally being granted the grace of death, another search was undertaken with the same result. Rumours were rife. Witnesses had seen her enter the old tunnels, drunk and with her dad's torch in her hand, and swore she never came out. That, of course, couldn't be true. Foul play was hinted at by some of the locals, and some of the hen party came to hear of it. Fearing they would be somehow implicated in a suspicious disappearance, several claimed that maybe it was remotely possible that the landlord's daughter had slipped by them unnoticed when interviewed by the police. Without any explanation for the disappearance, rumours regarding a possible love affair the landlord's daughter had been engaged in behind her betrothed's back arose and became accepted knowledge. Her betrothed never got over that. The landlord's daughter's now never-to-be future husband eventually passed, believing he'd never found love. This failure being at the forefront of his mind when he closed his eyes for the final time, it became his own personal, everlasting torment. Taken from the dictionary. Catatonia. Noun. Abnormality of movement and behaviour arising from a disturbed mental state, typically schizophrenia. It may involve repetitive or purposeless overactivity or catalepsy, resistance to passive movement and negativism. The last panel was screwed into place by the council worker with the chubby hands, completing the fence around the little clump of newly planted trees. Not so many screws in this panel as in the others, but it was a long walk back to his van to collect a couple of screws. It'd do. Subsidence, probably the result of the nearby pub being demolished with a wrecking ball to make way for a luxury apartment complex, had caused the old stone wall that separated the churchyard from the road to begin to collapse. The wall was demolished and saplings planted in an environmentally friendly attempt to shore up the earth and prevent any future movement. The saplings were then fenced off to prevent damage or theft while they took root, and pretty much forgotten about. Left alone to stretch their lazy way skyward as they pressed their roots into the soil below, their woody fingers clawing their way downwards until meeting the bony fingers of a hand that had tried, unsuccessfully, to claw its way upwards several decades earlier. The trees felt the torment of the landlord's daughter, locked in the very earth that had silenced her screams on her hen night, screams that might have alerted those searching for her, screams that would never be heard, and the trees screamed their own silent screams. And still those silent screams remained unheard. Bright and early, just like he'd promised, Angela rang the doorbell as he watched from the car. He'd thought she'd start being more careful with the electricity now she was having to pay the bills. Apparently not. He could see the bedroom light burning away in broad daylight. He smiled. Angela rang the doorbell a second time, then a third. He got out of the car. "Wait here, baby. I'll hop over the back fence and grab the spare key." He smiled at his daughter, eliciting a smile in return, and hid the knot in his tummy from her. He stood on tiptoes and spied over the first fence panel. There she was, stood at the open door, the curtains billowing around her. Her gown had fallen open and she trembled with the cold, her naked flesh covered in goosebumps. Her chin was pushed forward, mouth stretched wide and eyes like saucers, terrified saucers. As she stared at some point in the distance, appearing to be frozen in mid-scream, he shivered. Normally, although unusual, an admission of a patient suffering an unexplained catatonic state wouldn't necessarily raise many eyebrows. 2 before 10 in the morning would though, and 3 before 10:15 even more so. It was lunchtime before the cameras from the national news channels arrived, having been alerted by social media as to events in the area. 8 in total, the first having been discovered by his wife, who had woken to find he'd not returned from his regular night out. Every Sunday morning for as long as she could remember, she would wake up and find him lay next to her, stinking of kebab meat and still wearing his socks. This morning she jumped from her bed, startled by his absence, and struggled into her clothes. Once dressed, she drew open the curtains and found him, standing alone at the end of the driveway, facing away from the house, frozen in mid-scream, the tears that had spilled from his eyes staining his sooty face. The second, discovered by her estranged husband. A third, the local priest, Father Mackenzie, discovered by his housekeeper when he hadn't turned up to get the church ready for Sunday service. None responded to any stimulation, all with faces frozen in terror. Resistant to passive movement, all could be led, but upon stopping would reorientate themselves. It wasn't until the sixth case had been admitted that it was noticed all were choosing to stand facing in the same direction, all silently screaming at the same unseen horror. The panic. All she felt was panic, and pain, though that had ceased to concern her decades ago. There's only so much damnation a soul can feel before the soul becomes part of the damnation. Sadness, loss, grief, all these things she felt and all these things she sought. She didn't know why she sought such things, why she craved anguish and sorrow. It was an act driven by pure desperation. Misery, it seems, really does love company. She went to find it. Her terror, concentrated and pure, remained in the soil. The flesh was long dead, but her torment lived on. It bubbled and boiled away deep underground, entombed in the earth and becoming more potent with every new spring. It had almost escaped once before, the earth above finally beginning to yield to the tormented, ethereal clawing of the landlord's daughter's last scream, but those accursed living had prevented its escape. Within the roots of one of the young trees planted above, the torment found itself nurtured, fed by the sorrow, sobbed by the lonely, and carried on the dirty air into the leaves of the tree. The torment suckled on our pain and longed to be free of its own. Eventually, the torment seeped from the tree, and the panic it felt doubled. Now imprisoned within walls of timber, unable to concentrate, to see through the fog of agony and find a way to overcome this man-made barrier, until one night, when a man who no longer loved his wife had been taken short. The alcohol he'd consumed to mask the pain of his loveless existence couldn't hide it from the torment that seeped from the tree. She drew on it, nectar. She followed him, taking on more and more form as she wafted along behind him through the dark streets. Time and again she tried to attract his attention, to share her silent scream, but her broken nail brought forth nothing more than a shudder. Eventually, though, one shudder caused him to pause and, at last, he turned. She'd screamed first. The rush she'd felt as he'd screamed back was more potent than the sorrow on which she sustained herself so far. His scream joined hers and, like hers, remained unheard. Mostly. A hospital at night time is, so long as everything is running smoothly, a relatively quiet and peaceful place. Today the hospital had seen a lot of excitement and a lot of confused faces. Confused faces on the victims, on their loved ones, and most worryingly of all, on the gathered crowd of specialists. The word unprecedented was used a lot by both the specialists and the journalists who, for a good portion of the day, had besieged the little hospital. But now, visiting medical staff and journalists having retired to their respective travel lodge accommodation and visitors banished from the wards, was quiet time. There was a clunk deep and far away, and the lights all over the hospital dimmed, blurring the harshness of the scrupulously clean surfaces and stark walls to create a more relaxing environment. The 8 stood facing the corner of the ward. They continued their silent screaming as the lights dimmed, allowing the silvery fingers of that night's new moon to squeeze through the gaps in the blinds and creep across the floor. Dust motes, previously unseen under the harsh artificial lighting, danced in the moonlight, swirling and twirling as gracefully as a ballet dancer in a routine more complex than even the most elaborate choreography. A scream loses none of its potency if it's not heard. The screams of those suffering are filled with just as much anguish whether they remain unheard or startle and curdle another man's blood. The power remains, it festers, and it waits for ears to hear it. The unheard screams of the 8 echoed unheard around the ward. The dust motes that danced began to dance more and more frantically as darkness fell, bumping into and bouncing off one another, occasionally joining together and forming a larger mote. They moved en masse toward the 8, slowly coming together and becoming a denser cloud that drifted from screaming mouth to screaming mouth. She laughed at the more superstitious of her colleagues when they'd spoken of ghosts and spooky goings-on regarding the 8. She was a nurse, a woman of science, and she'd mocked their ridiculous notions. Inevitably, this had meant she'd become the member of staff exclusively lumbered with checking on them. No problem during the daylight hours with so many other people bustling about, but now, as she approached the door with the little glass pane in it, she was allowing her imagination to run away with itself. She looked through the pane. They'd moved. They were facing the door, seeming to be silently screaming right at her. The pane through which she peered steamed up, fogging her view of the patients. She wiped the pane with her hand, but the fog remained and became thicker. It was in the ward, a fog, a smoke. Fire! She pushed open the door and stepped inside to investigate and to get the 8 to safety. The fog became something other. A lady with curlers in her hair and broken nails running at her and screaming as she clawed the air before her. The unsuperstitious nurse opened her mouth and added her own torment to the power of the silent scream. The panic prevailed. The terror was unaware of those around her in any meaningful way. She saw the faces, the screaming, pleading faces, and she wanted to help, but her own terror, her own agony, they made thought impossible. Just instinct, blind, unquestioning instinct, and panic. More and more faces, twisted with the pain and the horror of the soul that dwelled behind the eyes, rushed to meet her as she fled. Fled or searched, she was unsure which. When it comes down to it, fleeing damnation and seeking salvation are two sides of the same coin. The air crackled with electricity as more screams were added to the silence. The nurse that had been sitting in the staff room, the cleaner that had been looking for Henry in a cupboard, the police officers flirting with the young student doctor in the waiting room, and the student doctor herself all screamed silently into the ether, all facing the same point in space and, once joined by the 2 photographers that had rushed through the doors upon seeing the Ferrari inside, finally, after decades, the scream reached the ears of the otherwise damned. He'd never really believed it. People had looked at him with pity. He was no longer himself, no longer the man that he'd grown into. Now he would forever be defined as that poor lad that young Ellie dumped. The problem with never having a truth confirmed is that we keep trying to understand. Invariably, we come up with the right answer, but its lack of confirmation causes us to formulate other possibilities, to make other theories, no matter how outlandish, plausible. He'd really loved his Ellie. He knew she loved him. He'd never have asked for her hand if he'd not been certain. He'd found Ellie. Ellie had been taken from him. He thought about her, longed for her touch, for the sound of her voice, every single day of the rest of his life. And the longing continued afterwards too. His last thoughts, his last wishes, everything he longed for in that last moment of life went with him. The pain, the sorrow, the misery, the loss. No longer able to hide his agonies behind that fleshy mask, it ran free, until her voice. He searched in the dark. The voice was behind him, always behind him, and so very faint at first. It got louder, then louder still. The volume increased until it was all he could hear. Shrill, agonising screams, many of them but only one. The same scream, screamed again and again at the very same time. And he went home. The wind blew hard. It tore down fences, it rattled windows, and it sent a chill down 1,000 necks. Then it died as suddenly as it sprung into life, rushing out like ripples on the surface of a pond from an old tree that a man had recently urinated on. It swept through the streets, the houses and the fields, passing over the land and leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Destruction and redemption. The truth about Nellie would never be known by anyone, except the 2 to whom it mattered most. The victims of the recent unexplained malaise recovered. The story and updates on the story were featured in every national newspaper for days until, frustrated by the lack of any more news and with politicians' names to blacken, the journalists lost interest. The victims were kept under observation for a week before the doctors deemed any further investigation pointless. A week during which the 8 mixed in the same day room before retiring to one of 2 wards depending on the sex of the victim. Visitors visited, loved ones declared love. An estranged husband apologised. A lacklustre husband took his wife out on Saturday night. Family members came together and buried hatchets and, from a chair in the corner, Father Mackenzie watched and rediscovered a faith he thought he'd long lost. It isn't only misery that loves a bit of company. Home really is wherever the heart is. Not our own heart, that comes with us wherever we go. It's the heart that makes our heart beat faster that dwells at home. The heart that's important to our continued living is the one that beats within our breasts. That heart is home.